Hello, I am Dr. Talia Charney, a naturopathic doctor and the Nutrition and Health Education Manager for PureSource. Today, I'm going to be providing you with a detailed training on the category of natural sweeteners. All of these sweeteners I'll be talking about today are provided by Now brand Real Foods. The first sweetener that we've ever used, of course, is ordinary sugar from sugarcane, which has been domesticated for about 10,000 years. It was discovered first in New Guinea. Of course, it has a long history, including sugar plantations and, unfortunately, exploitation of African slaves. We began to consume a lot more sugar in the 1970s, misguided by what we now know as or call the war on fats. You might be surprised to know that in Canada, the average daily consumption per capita of sugar is a whopping 26 teaspoons. In my experience, many people underestimate the amount of sugar they eat on a daily basis. So you can have them calculated by simply going to the nutrition facts labels on their food products and dividing the grams of sugar by 4. This will give you the number of teaspoons per serving size, and it is definitely a useful exercise. So how much sugar can we eat daily? Well, it's interesting to note, as you can see here, that there's a wide discrepancy of opinions. You have the World Health Organization saying that the optimal upper limit is 6 teaspoons. On the other hand, Health Canada, in the development of its new nutrition facts label, is suggesting an upper daily dose of 25 teaspoons. In my opinion, this great discrepancy is not based on a misunderstanding of science. It's simply the fact that politics and money play a great role when it comes to setting such policies. We are hardwired for sweets. Sugars stimulate dopamine production, a neurotransmitter in our brain, otherwise known as the pleasure hormone, and as many of us have experienced, this can result in what feels like a state of dependence. It's quite difficult to reduce our sugar intake, and we can experience withdrawal symptoms similar to drug addiction. So what are the consequences of too much sugar? Well, there's many possible consequences, some which we understand through science and other through experience. Diabetes, inflammation, obesity, heart disease, adrenal fatigue, immune suppression, and issues with our attention and focus. Since the 1950s, many companies have been searching for alternatives to sugar. Unfortunately, we have not offered many safe alternatives to the public, in my opinion. I'm not going to cover them in detail here, as they are here for your reference, but I will mention a few things. One important detail to note is whether in Canada or the US, the approval of these products as being safe can be based on studies provided by the manufacturers themselves, which obviously is a conflict of interest. Nevertheless, let's take a look at saccharin, for example. In 1977, it actually required a warning on the label that it causes cancer in lab rats. This was in the US. Today, that warning is no longer there. It is available in Canada as a tabletop sweetener only. Now, the manufacturers still admit it does cause bladder cancer, but they say not in humans. However, we cannot be sure that the cancer is caused through another unknown pathway that does apply to humans. You can see with cyclamate, similarly, there are concerns in terms of its potential carcinogenic properties. Aspartame is probably one of the most controversial artificial sweeteners, and there are at least 3 independent studies that show cancer in rodents. Now, it's interesting to note that there always seems to be a discrepancy between manufacturers' study results and independent studies. The manufacturers' results typically seem to be more favorable. Let's have a look at sucralose. This is an important one because you will unfortunately still find sucralose in some health food store products. Particularly look for protein powders or protein bars, although you might find it elsewhere. Quite recently, in 2016, a peer-reviewed publication was published, and it was based on an independent study in Italy that was more rigorous than the industry-funded studies to date, and it showed a significant risk of leukemia and blood-related cancers. Because of this study, a NGO called the Center for Science in the Public Interest suggested that we avoid sucralose altogether, and I certainly agree with that. Sucralose is a chemically manipulated product, and this results in what's called a chlorocarbon. PCBs and DDT, which is a banned herbicide, are also chlorocarbons. Chlorocarbons can deliver chlorine directly into our cells, and this is a hypothesis in terms of why it may be toxic to humans and cause problems. Anyway, you can look into it further, and as I have provided some information and studies. It used to be assumed that artificial sweeteners were safe, at least from the perspective of them being 0 calories and not having an effect on blood sugar levels, and therefore safe for diabetics. However, recent studies suggest otherwise. It is now known that artificial sweeteners, for example, in this case saccharin, seem to induce glucose intolerance. And that seems to correlate with an alteration in the gut microbiota, so in our gut bacteria, which is very interesting. A study on humans, as you can see I've represented here, showed a similar thing. So what the group that was fed water had a consistent microbiota throughout the study. The human group given glucose, simple sugar, had the same results as those drinking water. But as you can see, for those using saccharin, there was not only a growth in the amount of bacteria, but also the introduction of new species. And this is very interesting. Certainly there will be more studies on this topic. So the search continues to find healthier, perhaps safer alternatives to ordinary table sugar or artificial sweeteners for that matter. I'm going to be talking about 2 categories of sweeteners: non-nutritive sweeteners and nutritive sweeteners. So simply put, non-nutritive sweeteners are sweeteners that have no calories, or by definition less than 2% of the calorie value of sucrose, which is your ordinary table sugar, such as stevia, some alcohol sugars, and artificial sweeteners. And then I'll be talking about nutritive sweeteners. These are sweeteners that do add calories. They usually contain glucose and or fructose to varying degrees and in different ratios, and these would include things such as honey, molasses, maple syrup, and ordinary table sugar. So let's start with stevia. Stevia is a herb native to South America, and it has been used for centuries. Probably not in the way we use it today, in extracts and drops, but probably, as you see in this picture, a ground up dried leaf. In 1931, two French chemists discovered what gives the leaf its incredible sweetness. There are three white crystalline compounds that together are known as steviosides. This was a great discovery. So it's steviosides that impart the sweetness, and they're composed of glucose, saccharose, and steviol. Stevia, if you've ever tried it, is up to 300 times sweeter than table sugar. Its sweetness depends on how it's manufactured. It has little or no caloric value, and therefore a glycemic index of 0, meaning it has no effect on our blood sugar after we eat it. The stevia leaf contains 100 phytonutrients. So let's look at some of the studies on stevia. There was one to see if it lowered blood pressure, and another study to see what its effects were on blood glucose and insulin. Well, both of these studies suggest that stevia definitely is safe for those with normal or high blood pressure, and safe for those who have to watch their blood sugar levels. However, neither of these studies are strong enough for us to be recommending stevia to treat such conditions. In 2017, a safety study was done on stevia. So this is basically a toxicity study, and the results were that there are no negative side effects for stevia, which is great news. So now let's talk about the Now brand stevia. You can see here a picture of the fields where the Now brand stevia is sourced from. Now brand stevia is known as Now Better Stevia, and it's trademarked because it has a specific patented process. So Better Stevia is extracted firstly from the whole leaf, and it is full spectrum. Remember, I said there are three steviosides, all of which impart the natural flavoring or sweetness, and the Better Stevia contains all three of them. So that's what I mean by full spectrum. Then there is a patented extraction process. The great thing about it, firstly, is that there are no chemical solvents used. This process just involves the use of water and alcohol, as well as some enzymes. And the advantage of the special process is that it reduces the licorice-like aftertaste that some stevia brands impart. In fact, this is one of the reasons why some people don't like stevia. But the Now Better Stevia is well known for its better taste. Here you can see a very simple explanation of how the Better Stevia is made. You have the original compound extracted, and a glucose molecule is added to it using an enzyme. And here's a simplified flow chart. You can see we start with the whole dried stevia leaves and end up with the enzyme treated stevia and what you are able to buy in the stores today. So in conclusion, the Now Better Stevia, it has no bitter aftertaste, it is full spectrum using all three steviosides, it's calorie free, has a low glycemic impact, it's sustainably grown, there are certified organic varieties offered, all of the Now stevias are non-GMO and gluten-free. So because Now is so well known for its stevia, it offers a wide variety for anybody's needs. Tablets, powders, packets, liquids that are alcohol-free, unflavored, and flavored. So let's have a look at some of them. You can see here there are some stevias that are in a form that's very convenient for those who want a portable sweetener. And that would be the tablets or the packets. It also comes in bulk, as you can see. Better Stevia Balance is a stevia with added inulin and chromium. Inulin is known mostly as a prebiotic, so it feeds good bacteria in our gut. It's basically a soluble fiber, and it also imparts its own natural sweetness, which for some can sort of temper the taste of stevia if you still find it too sweet for your liking. It also has chromium in it, which is a trace mineral often used by diabetics. So this formula, while anyone could use it, may be particularly applicable to someone with diabetes. Then of course stevia comes in a variety of sizes of packets. Here you can see one example of the liquid stevias. So most of them contain alcohol or in a base of alcohol, but the alcohol-free ones are in a glycerin base. Because glycerin has its own sweetness to it, the stevia glycerides are slightly sweeter than the rest of them. You can see here that the Now Better Stevia liquid extracts come in a wide variety of flavors. They can be used in many ways. I often add them to my drinks, for example, to a chai tea. Could be for coffee substitute. You could use them in baking. You could buy unflavored protein powders and therefore have the flexibility of changing the flavors on a day-to-day basis. So there's a lot of great uses for these stevia flavors. Here I've just provided a sweetener equivalency chart. So if somebody wants to replace stevia with sugar in a recipe, they can use this as a guide. You can also see I've provided the link to the Now Foods website, where you can find a equivalency chart that actually includes all of the sweeteners that they make. I've just simply showcased here the stevia one. Now it still does take some experimenting, because although the sweetnesses may be equivalent, baking can be a little bit more complex. There may be differences when it comes to different sweeteners in terms of dryness, consistency, ability to brown, or how certain sweeteners react to heat. So there is a bit of a learning curve. Here's just a list of the natural sweeteners that I will be talking about next, starting with what we call alcohol sugars. So alcohol sugars, or sometimes they're called sugar alcohols. In either case, they're actually not technically sugar, but that is the name they go by. And they're easily identified by the ending OL, so erythritol, xylitol, sorbitol. They're naturally occurring in small amounts in foods, and most of them have a minimal effect on blood sugar. You can see erythritol has no effect, a glycemic index of 0. Maltitol a little bit higher, a glycemic index of 36 to 52. You need to be cautious and warn customers about sugar-free claims. Because alcohol sugars are not technically sugars, a product can say sugar-free, but still contain a sweetener like maltitol, which may not be appropriate for some diabetics. And the alcohol sugars are typically considered to be non-cariogenic as well, meaning that they won't cause cavities. Xylitol has a considerable amount of studies with respect to that, although they are, for the most part, industry funded. And some of them even suggest not only does it not cause cavities, but that it can help prevent cavities. So let's start with xylitol, because it is probably the most used alcohol sugar in natural health products, and you'll particularly find it in chewing gums. It's a great baking alternative, a one-to-one replacement for sugar, so that makes it easy. It tolerates heat well, so therefore again helpful when it comes to baking. But it does not brown or caramelize. So if that's something that you want, then maybe xylitol would not be the best choice in that case. It also absorbs a fair amount of liquid. So that means if using it in a recipe, it may require the addition of liquid. Now, speaking of absorbing liquids, this brings me to one additional point, which is that because alcohol sugars typically do absorb liquid, and they're typically not absorbed in our upper GI, so they make their way down to our colon, they tend to, at a certain point, have a laxative effect. Okay, so continuing with xylitol, and I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about the laxative effect. Xylitol is sometimes called a wood sugar. Well, this is simply because it can be sourced from hardwoods. But xylitol has other natural sources, such as corn, and the Now brand uses non-GMO corn. It has a low glycemic index, as I mentioned, of 13. Well, the laxative effect of xylitol typically would occur between 30 to 50 grams on the average. Everybody's different, of course, so keep that in mind. Each packet of xylitol has between 15 and 20 grams. So that means if someone were to use 2 packets, they may be ingesting about 30 grams, which is just at the very beginning of the potential for a laxative effect. As I said, it's very individual. There are many things that can cause a laxative effect, such as vitamin C or magnesium of any kind. They all have a particular threshold, and it's different for every person. So it's just a matter of testing it out. An important thing to note about xylitol is it's highly toxic to dogs, so make sure that you mention this to any customers buying it. We offer xylitol in a number of different forms, in packets, in bulk, and there is xylitol plus, which is a mixture of xylitol and stevia. So that was xylitol. Erythritol is another alcohol sugar. I really like it, actually. I use it myself. It has a glycemic index of 0. So no effect on blood sugars. If you put it in your hand, it looks and feels a lot like ordinary table sugar, only it has virtually no calories. And it's about 70% as sweet as table sugar. Most interesting thing about erythritol is it's digested differently than the other alcohol sugars. So remember, I said that they may have a laxative effect because they go down into the colon and have a property where they draw water towards them. Well, erythritol doesn't do that. It's actually fully absorbed in the upper GI and eliminated by the kidneys. So if you have somebody who cannot consume xylitol because they're very sensitive, have a very low tolerance to it, then erythritol would be a great alternative. Here's an equivalency table if you want to replace sugar with erythritol in a recipe. So let's just look at ordinary commercial sugar, known as sucrose. And what are some of the reasons why we might want to avoid it and look to alternatives? Well, one of those reasons may be because it is processed using a filter made from ground up cattle bone. Another reason is that by and large, most commercial sugar is sourced from genetically modified corn, and that's definitely something that may not be desirable for many health consumers. Commercial sugar has a glycemic index of about 65. Just keep that in mind as a basis for comparison for others. Of course, it's also devoid of nutrients because it's highly processed. And lastly, traces of mercury have been found in commercial sugar byproduct that you would know as high fructose corn syrup. So here's a flow chart just showing in general how commercial sugars are made. You will notice halfway through where the red circle is that when sugar is centrifuged, molasses is produced, and it is basically separated from the sugar product. Molasses has minerals and vitamins in it, and those are all lost at that point. If you want a simple way to distinguish the three types of sugar, turbinado, brown sugar, and ordinary table sugar, which I refer to as granulated sugar, you can refer to the molasses content. So turbinado sugar is the least processed and has more molasses. Brown sugar just has a little bit of molasses, and the ordinary table sugar has virtually no molasses. Here's some interesting facts that I learned about sugar based on a study in 2009. So it turns out that based on this study, there's a substantially higher antioxidant level in less refined forms of sugar. The highest levels were found in blackstrap molasses, and then maple syrup, brown sugar, and honey. In fact, substituting alternative sweeteners could increase the antioxidant intake on an average of 2.6 millimoles a day, which is similar to the amount found in a serving of berries or nuts. This is another great reason to eat less processed sugar. So let's look at some other forms of sugar. Date sugar, for example, which I enjoy on the occasion. Date sugar is simply finely chopped dry dates. It's raw, it's completely unprocessed, and so it comes with all the nutrients that would exist in a date: fiber, vitamins, and minerals. It's composed of fructose, glucose, sucrose, and some complex carbohydrates. Most people would describe it as pleasant tasting, but it doesn't melt like sugar when you put it into a hot liquid. It can be a little bit grainy, so it's considered excellent for baking. It has a glycemic index of 50. So remember, the glycemic index is an indication of how much it affects blood sugar levels. The glycemic index of 50 is considered low, and ordinary table sugar is 65. So it would be a better choice for somebody who's trying to watch their blood sugar levels. Date sugar can be used as a replacement for ordinary table sugar or even unprocessed cane sugar as a one-to-one. So what about sucanat? Sucanat is simply dried sugar cane syrup. So it's the less or unprocessed version of ordinary table sugar. It has all the parts and properties of the sugar cane except for the water. So the molasses component has not been removed. It has traces of iron, calcium, B6, potassium, and chromium. And it would be used just as a one-to-one substitute for table sugar, of course. Its glycemic index is most likely the exact same as its processed counterpart, which would be 65, although I can't find specific information on sucanat. Dextrose. So what dextrose is actually glucose. It's just another word for glucose, which is the simple sugar that is used by all of our cells to produce energy. This particular dextrose is made, again, from non-GMO corn. So why would we use dextrose? Because firstly, it doesn't have an advantage over ordinary table sugar in terms of sweetness. It's only 0.75 times as sweet. And it doesn't have an advantage over ordinary table sugar in its glycemic index either. In fact, the glycemic index of dextrose is 100, which is very high. So why would we use it? Well, if you're diabetic, you probably know that dextrose can sometimes be provided in a pill form, and people, particularly those who use insulin, will carry dextrose around with them, and if they get dangerously low blood sugars, which can occur, they will take dextrose. Dextrose, because it is exactly what our cells can immediately use, which is glucose, will provide an immediate source of energy. So that's one of its uses. Because, again, it provides a readily available and instant source of energy for our cells, it can also be used for athletes before, during, or after their workouts. I have provided as well an equivalency table in comparison to sugar for those who may find that helpful. Now fructose is a pure crystalline fructose, which is another type of sugar that does naturally occur in fruits, for example. The main reasons why fructose is considered desirable as compared to table sugar is, firstly, it has a lovely natural sweetness, and it's 1.5 times sweeter than table sugar. Another advantage is that it has a very low glycemic index of only 19. So this means that it will not spike the blood sugar in any significant way. Fructose is also not insulin dependent. So if you want to replace table sugar with fructose, you can see there is an equivalency part. There's an equivalency chart that I've provided here. But that's not the end of the story. Before getting to some of the controversies over fructose, I just want to show you a little bit about the fructose content when it comes to food labels. So in Canada, if you see the term glucose fructose on the label, this means that there is less than 60% fructose and it is unbound. So basically there's a combination of glucose and fructose. If you're in the US, you will see high fructose corn syrup, and you of course are probably familiar with that anyway, even in Canada with that term. High fructose corn syrup can contain varying amounts of fructose depending on which type. There's high fructose corn syrup 42, which has 42% fructose, 55 and 90. The label actually doesn't distinguish between the three, but high fructose corn syrup 55 is the most common type. So what about the controversies over fructose? There are sort of two schools of thought. You will hear some people saying fructose is dangerous and it's toxic and we should avoid it. You will hear another school of thought saying fructose is natural and it's fine. Well, I think that the answer lies somewhere in between. So this chart here is to show you how fructose is metabolized in a liver cell and why consuming excessive amounts of fructose may be problematic. Emphasis on the excessive. So excessive amounts may be consuming fructose in the form of high fructose corn syrup, drinking tons of sugary pop. So it all depends on how much. But as you can see, if you follow the pathway of fructose to the right, excessive amounts of fructose can cause an increase in uric acid, and high uric acid levels are associated with gout. It can also cause, if you see to the right of uric acid, a lowering of nitric oxide. This can potentiate hypertension, so a raise in blood pressure. High amounts of fructose can also raise insulin levels, and over time, of course, just like with what occurs with ordinary table sugar, we can develop insulin resistance, and this is on the pathway to diabetes. High amounts of fructose can also raise our triglyceride levels, and that is a type of fat, and high levels are associated with increased risk of heart disease. So definitely there is a reason to believe that we need to moderate our amounts of fructose. That doesn't mean avoiding it. It's just all about balance and understanding. Let's look at lactose now. Lactose, as you probably know, is a sugar that is found in human breast milk. Lactose accounts for 80% of the carbohydrates in human milk, and it is therefore obviously a desirable type of sugar for growing infants. In fact, there are studies, interesting studies, that suggest that galactose, which is part of lactose, so lactose is a disaccharide, it has two sugar molecules. It has, as you can see, galactose and glucose. So it seems that galactose may inhibit tumor growth and its spread. Galactose is also a substance that may decrease inflammation, enhance cellular communication, and even increase calcium absorption, which makes sense if you have a growing baby. But it's only 20% the sweetness of sugar, so it doesn't really make sense to use it as a sugar replacement, although its glycemic index is relatively low at 45. So it makes sense when it comes to the use for infants, obviously, but perhaps its use in adults is less well known. If you want to read more about the topic, I've provided a link to an article written, Why Lactose is Good for You, and also a link to a video online, Lactose Intolerance, just in case you want to learn more about that. Lastly here, I just wanted to provide you with some helpful links for your continued education. You can see the first two links are to the Now website, one of those where you will find the charts that I've been talking about for sugar and other sweetener equivalencies. You can also see the links with regards to lactose I was just speaking about. And the last bullet there, you will see there's a link to a sugar and sweetener guide to see the relative glycemic indexes of different types of sweeteners. I thank you for listening, and I hope that you find this review of the category of natural sweeteners helpful and are able to better help your customers on this topic.